the part that I wanted to start with, we can kind of dispense with, but I wanted to remind you of a couple of sources that are worth noting, since this is the concluding section for this go-round. If you want to do some digging, tomorrow, George Marsden is the prominent author that everybody cites. Everybody talks about him. This is his book. Now, I'll show you the cover of the new version of it. Unfortunately, when I started looking, I said, I gotta get this, I gotta go online and buy it. And I found some and they weren't expensive, but I realized that the reason they weren't expensive is because here's the new one on the left.
New and improved.
Yeah. So the new and improved is like $40. And I'm
Buy the old one.
a little skittish about, getting too many $40 books in the library that I'll, use as a resource from time to time. But a couple of these others that I'll show you are available free online that you can get. For example, the fundamentals that we've talked about so much. Several sites have the whole section, and this is massive. Remember, it's 12 volumes. So it's a lot, and each one has a ton of articles from different sources, not just Presbyterians, not just people. And interestingly, it wasn't that widely read at the time, but everybody knew about it, and everybody cited it, and everybody talked about how influential it was. But this is theology by theologians for, the ones who are really into it. He sent it out to preachers, to YMCA counselors, anybody that was anywhere in the, yeah, go ahead, Terry, that's good too. So anybody that was anywhere in Christian America that he could get an address to, Lyman Stewart's paid for and sent out copies of this. So the one in the middle here, I don't know why they made the icon of it so big, but that is the one that if you only had to pick one, that's the one I'd buy. And you can get this online in a used good shape for less than $10. So that's a good deal. I think mine was 5 or 6 or something like that. I liked it so well after checking it out from the library, and found it that good that what Frances Fitz, and she got a Pulitzer for it, I think, if I remember right. What she does that no one else does is she gets inside their heads. She works with the motivation, of some of the people that were in it. And in some cases, she'll go to sources like the wife of someone famous and say, here's what's going on behind the scenes. And so, for example, she talks about William Bell Riley that I had not heard of, and it bothered me that I hadn't. And I told you about him out of the Twin Cities, and how he started the university after being the #1 fundamentalist for 12 years or more, and passed on the torch to none less than, remember?
Nope.
Yeah, Billy Graham is his successor. So he's terribly important. I probably wouldn't have known about him, because he only gets asterisk status in these other, and I don't know why that is, having dug into this. The guy on the right you can find in YouTube about 5 years ago doing a talk that's related to this book. The thesis of the book is we need to get back to the center and get that good old time religion, which he means to be mainline religion, as opposed to getting caught up in the stuff that's officially our topic for today. This is a great book. This one you can get for less than $5. It doesn't make any sense, but they must have overproduced. He writes for the New York Times, so this guy has got some pedigree to him. The one that I'm mostly using today, or using a lot from, maybe is a better way to put it, I've cited over and over again here in this whole series going back to last year. Gary Wills writes on everything under the sun religious and everything under the sun political in the US, going back to Nixon years at least. His first big runaway bestseller was during the Nixon years, called Nixon Agonistas. And back in those days, he was on 60 Minutes in the point counterpoint, and he was holding down the conservative side as is supposed to. But this is a guy who has taken on Catholicism, even though he's a practicing and believing Catholic, and says the priesthood is the problem. It's not Catholics that are the problem, it's the priests. And it's how they think of themselves, and we got to get rid of that. Oh my! I'm sure he's endeared himself to those that he studied under. Anything you can find from Mark Knoll, this is his latest version. It's a great book, but again, it's $40 because it's too new. So the older ones, you know, you can get fine. But if there's one that's within 5 years, I kind of feel like I want to wait another couple of years and see if maybe it'll get down below $10, and then maybe I'll pop for it. So the one that I bought, which is the textbook, which was apparently in wide adoption this year, I just love. This is great reading, and I think I paid $25 for this one. So this one was worth it in order to get the encyclopedic edition that included particularly Lutherans and the different groups and how they merge together. Kind of a counterpoint to everything that Mark Knoll writes, because Mark Knoll is inside the movement. He's a fundamentalist. But he's capable of stepping outside that. I shouldn't say a fundamentalist. He's an evangelical. Nowadays, the terminology is different. And that's what we'll talk about next year, how these guys split off. Basically, the kickoff point has to do with being involved in the world. The fundamentalists practice what came to be known by historians as the Great Reversal. The early revivals were very interested in social work and ameliorating the problems in America. The fundamentalists said, no, we got to save souls, and that's it. That's really what we're here for. And so we're not too concerned. Yeah, that's pretty callous, it sounds like at first, but to them it's just a matter of priority. It's just a matter of, you've got limited resources, where do you focus? So the way that this was probably best put was by Dwight Moody, who's the grandfather of all of them, and the guy who builds the big tent under which all of these guys, practice and start out and then fan out. He said, it's like God put me in a lifeboat and the ships are sinking all around, and he said, save all that you can. That's what I'm here for. That's it. So with that as our background, today we are to talk about fundamentalism, next phase. And the distinction that I'll say in one of the slides coming up is that this is a subheading within fundamentalism. But if you were to look at the American scene and all those who are non-denominationalists, it pretty much dominates that set of Christians in the US, and it includes people from all denominations. I can't find it, but the Pew people did a survey on ELCA early after ELCA was formed, and it asked about, I remember filling it out, it asked about, how do you feel about this? What, pick the following statement that best represents your thought. And among ELCA, more, I think, than any other response with respect to how do they treat the Bible was what today would be considered a fundamentalist response, a literal document, the literal word, not what Pastor Bob articulated today. So, you know, I told you the story about the gathering in Riverside where about 1/3 to 40% of the delegates raised red cards against the Book of Faith because they thought it was being rammed down their throats from Chicago. That's a part of that same reactionary kind of impulse. So it's worthwhile, I think, for us to go back to the kind of the founding of fundamentalism and try and capture not only some of the thoughts, but where did they get it out of the Bible? You know, as Lutherans, we say with Luther, if you can't show me something in the Bible where that comes from, then I'm going to tell you that's man-made. And I may be very interested in it, and I may even believe it, but you're not going to get me to say that that's doctrine, that that's something that my faith hinges on, you know, unless you can show me some scriptural background, you know. That's Luther at the Diet of Worms. He says, you know, here I stand, I'm sorry, you know, if you can't persuade me, I gotta disagree with you. So our man is Cyrus Scofield, Cyrus Ingersoll Scofield. Interesting character. He's kind of a roustabout in church history.
Let me do the light.
He's out of Missouri. He started out well. If you're a proponent, is that better? Thanks, Dave. In ministry, but he runs afoul primarily, according to the sources that I see, from drinking. And he winds up in jail. And in jail, he supposedly has a conversion. And after the conversion, what does he do? He leaves his wife and family and goes off to work for Dwight L. Moody, same guy that we mentioned before. Here's what he hangs his hat on is from Timothy, 2 Timothy. And he talks about rightly dividing the word of truth. Now this will be about the only place, except for Scripture itself, that I really want you to dig in and watch the words and spend, mostly for most, including the charts, I'm going to fly through these because of our time. And again, they'll be posted on the YouTube channel just as soon as Chris gets a hold of it. So you can spend as much time, you know, after the fact on these if you want to. But Scofield is worth it, you know, for us to get a handle on it, because he's the guy that decides he wants to rewrite, as it were, the Bible. So what he's going to do is he's going to take King James, got to be King James as far as he's concerned, and he's going to add his own commentary right next to it on the same page. This is the first time that's done. So he calls it a reference Bible. Today we would call it a study Bible, you know. But he had this brilliant idea, and it's so effective that later on generations to come will memorize pages from Scofield's Bible, and they can't tell the difference between whether it was the Bible's words, the King James words, or Scofield's words, because they were on the same page. And they memorized it all. And they remembered that, and so it just drives home the point that much more. Okay. Thanks to Gary Wills, I realized that, very interestingly, this passage that he's hanging his hat on, let's look at it in multiple translations. All right, here's King James, rightly dividing, note the words, And note how it starts out. Just grab a hold of that because I want to show you half a dozen versions here now. Ready? Okay. Here's Darby's version. Darby is the originator back in England. Darby's writing his translation of the Bible just for private study. This is not for worship. Notice that he's saying, cutting a straight line to the word of truth. According to Gary Wills, that's very close. The idea is you want to build a path to understanding exactly what's in there. A little different from dividing, isn't it? But look at what Elka says today in the passage that we would go from the latest version of, why aren't we highlighting here then? Oh well. The RSV in the early 50s finds its way into use. This is the one that's so explosive because of Isaiah 7:14 that says a young maiden shall conceive. And it became a runaway bestseller for everybody except the fundamentalists who hated it because of that. The latest version that we would use today, the updated version, which is just a couple years old now, says, rightly explaining the word of truth. That makes me scratch my head a little bit because that sounds so different. So obviously the translators of the New Revised Standard are seeing something different in those words. Now, I like that better, but is that, back to what you've asked about from time to time, Tony, is that a good translation? Or is the latest scholarship says this is a better way to approach that language? Now remember, this is where Schofield is kicking things off.
But how do we know we're rightly explaining the word of truth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first modern translation of the King James that tried to break it into new language was the American Standard Version, but it was too wooden. It lost the poetry of King James, so it never really sold very much. People thought it was a great translation, but they didn't love it. So they tried again, and they got the new American Standard. And the NASB is still in use. A lot of people use that now because it's a little bit more modern language, and it's an alternative. It doesn't sound as, it doesn't include all the politically correct language that the NRSV or the latest updated edition of the NRSV does. So finally, here's the one that is so controversial because it's not an exact translation to start with by definition. But it is the fundamentalist Bible. It is the one that is posed as the alternative. When we moved to New York, we had a friend from our congregation there that gave me a paperback version of it that was starting to go bad a little bit, so he bought himself a hardback. He said, here, this is the latest and the greatest scholarship. I didn't know any better. I didn't know it was a paraphrase, you know. So if you look for a shortcut in terms of what's the difference, they say it's thought for thought instead of word for word. That's a shortcut, shorthand explanation for it. But the latest translation that's kind of fascinating, in 2011, they all but banned the fundamentalists and the evangelicals, because the committee changed, they adopted the new language, and in some cases they did violence to the text. Well, as far as N.T. Wright is concerned, they did violence to Paul in 1978. So, you know, but Messiah still offers that in the Free Bibles rack that we've got coming in. And 20 years ago, Messiah had a leatherette Bible that all the members, I think, probably got, and it was NIV too. And it was the Lutheran Study Bible by Concordia. Concordia and Missouri Synod loved the NIV until the ESV came out. So just to give you a little taste as we get ready to go in, because there's more. Now, I thought for giggles I would do what I always say. That is to say, let's look at context here. Here's 2 Timothy. Remember, this is Paul talking to Timothy, supposedly. Modern scholarship's not so sure that it really is Paul, but someone like Paul, or someone who understood Paul or followed in his footsteps, wrote these instructions to keep on the ministry when Paul was going to be gone. He saw the end coming. So what I've highlighted in yellow is what immediately preceded it. Does that change the way that you look at it? Rightly dividing the word of truth. Don't wrangle over the words. Interesting stuff, huh? But that's precisely what Pastor Bob was talking about today, and precisely what the dispensationalists do. They do want to wrangle over the words. They want to fight about them. And if you don't get it right, they'll write you out. And at the end it says, have nothing to do with stupid and senseless controversies. Oh my goodness. Guess what? You're going to see a lot of controversy in what we're going to see the rest of today. All right. So this is now straight out of Gary Wills. The verb in Greek, thankfully we have other people that can translate for us and tell us what it means. We don't have to study the Greek. I wouldn't want to do that. That's the one thing I was not good at in college. You know, that's almost as bad as math. Anne's great with foreign languages. She can handle that. Takes me a lot longer. I love trying to get pieces in conversational German, but I couldn't conjugate a verb, you know, unless I spent a month trying to learn how. So here it is. The King James says it's dividing. It actually means to cut straight. You go back, the only one that does that right is Darby himself. Everybody else has a different twist on it. And yet this is what Schofield says we're going to start with. So what he's going to say is the antithesis of what you heard from Pastor Bob. Comments?
Well, I would just say, I understood a long time ago, you know, that whatever Bible I read, it was a translation. And I have felt a discomfort having known that it comes from older languages, and really a dead language, Aramaic, right?
Yeah.
And to some extent, even the original Hebrew that the original Old Testament was written in doesn't exist today,
Right.
as it did then. So the modern Hebrew is not Old Hebrew. So I've always felt a discomfort reading the Bible, knowing that I've always wondered how accurate is what I'm reading.
Yeah.
But I want to stress that I try to pick out big picture items, what's important,
Yep, the
and
truths.
right, and not, you know, was there a flood? Probably. Does it matter? Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I'm thinking about the big picture, and I don't want to argue necessarily. I think it's good to get our, as we do, right, Joe? We have our discussions on Saturdays in our men's Bible study, and we have our disagreements, or no, I think it's this. And you know, like it says here, we shouldn't argue about this. We can give our opinions, but what's the big picture?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've talked about with both pastors, Bob and Jay, is maybe starting next year with a workshop on tools that are available online for free to help with sorting out concepts and sorting out translations and so forth. And one of the things I've been doing for a long time is say, let's look at this. It's very easy to do with some of the tools that we've got online now. You know, it takes a while to reformat it to get it on a page like this, but if you just want to find out what do the big Bibles say, you know, for the meaning on this verse, and now let me look at it in context. That's not hard. And that's helpful. And there are other tools that you don't have to stay in the same site to do. So we're talking about maybe trying to throw together a workshop like that to kick off the new year. So,
Jake,
okay.
which of the versions would you recommend
Well,
as a
if I were to
study
buy it
Bible?
today, it's unfortunate because Missouri Synod, I'm trying to find a nice way to say this, does not accept the New Revised Standard that ELCA does. But Missouri Synod has the best translation from the standpoint of giving you lots of information that not only gives you exposition, but gives you a Lutheran context. It's gorgeous. It's an absolutely wonderful. But it's what I call NRSV light. And the story as to how you got the ESV, which is now public domain, the English Standard Version, which is what they use now. It's almost the same as the previous New Revised Standard. I would say that at least 80% is word for word. So you're not losing much. They would say that number one, they wanted to tone down the politically correct pieces of it, and not substitute a plural to capture men and women where the original language says men only, stuff like that. And they had a few quibbles. And according to the fellow who was the head of the translation committee that came to talk to us at my old church, who was a former professor to the pastor that we had at the time, said that a committee from what became the English Standard Version approached the World Council of Churches and said, we would like to use the NRSV, but there's just some parts of it that make us uncomfortable. If you'll let us reprint it with the changes that we want, we'll give you a bunch of money.
Uh-huh.
And they said, how hard is this? So that's how, according to the story that we were told by the fellow who was in charge of the committee, came up. So I would say, if I were buying today, I'd say the same thing as I told Terry a year ago.
Yeah.
Still, the best that's out there from a Lutheran standpoint is still
I followed Jake's advice.
the Lutheran Study Bible is gorgeous, and I'll bring one that you can look at. You can get a big one that's like 3 inches thick with a little bit wider print, or you can get one that's kind of standard and the pages are thin and it's 8 or 9 point at best.
It's just called the Lutheran Study Bible?
Yeah, Concordia's Lutheran Study Bible.
Yeah, you just go to the Concordia website. I got the big print version, even though I wear glasses.
Yeah, and
8 or 9 point.
and what's really great about that one, Linda, is they include periodically a little section with icons to let you know the flavor of the commentary that they're giving. And one of the little icons that they do says, this is something that you can use for devotions as a Lutheran. And it refers back to Lutheran documents over and over and over again. So that's kind of cool. And it's especially useful, I hate to say this, but in my humble opinion, it's especially useful because ELCA has not emphasized Lutheran doctrine, Lutheran faith. They've kind of smoothed over the rough edges, sort of like Pastor Bob today, talking about how it's bigger than any one faith, it's bigger than any one,
But the Lutheran Study Bible is based on which version?
It's on the ESV.
The ESV.
On this one.
Okay, got it.
And it's good. And it's better than what it used to be, which was, before was the NIV.
Yeah, which is what
The
most of us use now.
NIV in 78 was the one that most people knew about.
Yeah.
And it's good, but it's, there are times you're saying, is this the same Bible? Because it really sounds differently. They're trying in this version to put it in more modern English and to capture the idea again, thought for thought. They don't want to lose anything, but they are reacting to the RSV, which was the first modern translation that tried to keep the tone of King James and keep the sound and feel. And that's still, by my cousin who taught the pre-sem students, their Greek and their Latin, he thinks the RSV is still the best that's to be had anywhere, even though it was controversial at the time, that it's the truest. And the interesting thing to me is that in our history, for our age, we happen to be able to think back to 1965 when the Pope said, you know what? We're going to have a new Vatican Council and we're going to bring everybody in and we're going to open up the windows of the church. And we're going to let some air in and we're going to let people look in and we'll look out to the world, and if it helps us to understand, we want to use it. So the only modern faith which accepts the new criticism by definition is Catholicism. So they didn't have any problem in buying the RSV, and they don't have a problem with the NRSV, and I imagine they're buying the updated edition too, that's a couple of years old now. Because in their brilliance, the World Council of Churches says, we'll put a different cover on it and we'll make it the Catholic version. And, I don't know if there are other changes that they've done, obviously other things that they would add to make it, a study Bible that they like. But if you were to buy that, that would be fine. Now, they also have something that still dates back to the ancient translation that was good for 1,000 years in Catholicism that St. Jerome did. Imagine that, a translation that stayed in place that was still good for 1,000 years, a millennium. That's really something. But that one, go ahead, Tony.
Are you saying that that's a St. Jerome Bible? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I would be curious, and maybe you've mentioned this before, is there a version where has gone back to the modern, the scripture that's been found up to now, a lot of these Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. Okay, and that has been translated, from, I'm going to say, as original as you can have in text.
Okay.
From Old and New Testament. Is there a version of a Bible like that with none of this changing of, if it said man, I'm fine with that. I mean, I know I'm a man, but I mean, because to me, sometimes it means man and it's literal man, and sometimes it means mankind, which encompasses, right? So I would not want any flavoring. If it said man, then let it be man. If it meant mankind,
They do try
yeah.
the World Council of Churches version, that is the one that Elka accepts. Most academics would tell you that's the best at what you're talking about.
Which one?
NRSV.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they would say, for example, that when it comes to what's been discovered at Qumran and also what was discovered later at Nag Hammadi, what we've learned from those really doesn't do that much to change, but it's fascinating to study. What happened was, in exile, the Jews put together the Masoretic text. And for hundreds of years, they had scholars that not only made the translation and sorted it out, but they numbered every letter and every vowel, and they added pronunciation guides, and they said, this is the best that we've got, using everything that was available up to that time. And that's newer in terms of our experience, but it uses texts that are older, the best that could be found, some which predate Jesus by quite a bit. So what Jesus and Paul are using is the one that came out of Alexandria. And that's not bad. It was the best that was available, you know, at the day. And that's the one, interestingly, I remember I showed you the Geneva Bible that the Calvinists started from. That's what they're hearkening back to. The Eastern Orthodox Church today still uses that Bible. They still use that one. It's called the Septuagint. And the story behind it, SEPT is, as a prefix,
Oh, I mean 7 in French.
what's the number?
7.
7, yeah. And the idea is, theoretically, the story goes, it's a legend, but it works to the Bible's favor, and, you know, everybody gets excited. 70 scholars got together, separate, and they all came up with the exact same wording when they got together. How likely is that? But the idea is all of these people, you know, work together out of what was at that point in time, in the 3rd century thereabouts, you know, when they completed it all, that was the best that could be had. The Masoretic text starts in about AD 600, or in the Common Era 600, but it's using stuff that goes way, way back. So if most modern Bibles that you'll see are going to use that Masoretic text. The Masoretes were a sect within Judaism that devoted themselves. That was their whole life. Their whole life was based around getting it right. So I think you can pretty comfortably say that scholars who have a better head for us than us for the languages and all that goes into translation, they've done good work. But other stuff keeps reappearing. For example, one of the things I didn't get to talk about, but I think is just fascinating as all get out, is the search for the ancient manuscripts. What's a manuscript? It's something that's handwritten. You know, it's not typed with a typewriter or a word processor or a computer. And so, in theory, you want the oldest one that you can get, thinking that's the closest that you can get. Now, what's fascinating is the Presbyterians are going to take this all the way to bedrock. And they're going to say the Bible is inerrant. It's without error. It's what God wanted to have said in the original. Where's the original? We don't have it. you can't get there from here. So then what you want is the closest that you can get. All right, so turn of the century, one of the things that was highly popular, and again the Germans were kind of in the lead, although the English were involved in it too, and they struck gold first. There's a monastery at the 2,000 foot or something like that level at Mount Sinai. It's hard to get to. You got to traipse up by yourself. You can't drive there. And so it's like a hermitage. It's like a place where you're going to go and really be a monk. You know, really be. So this Bible hunter looking for old ancient manuscripts was there, and he was going to go home because he felt he'd not been able to get anything that they didn't have already. And this tired old monk came in to light the fire in his room, and he's tearing pages out and throwing it in the fire. And suddenly this Bible hunter looks at it and he says, "Let me see that." And it turns out it's the oldest Bible that we have of all time. And they've been using it. The same thing happened with the text from Nag Hammadi. You know, when these urns were dug up, you know, the kid took them home to his mom. His mom put pages in the fire to light the fire, and then he said, "You know, I think maybe these are worth something. Let's not burn anymore. Let me see if I can get some money for them." And the next thing you know, we've got 30 or 40 texts, some of which date in as early as 100 AD, maybe the Gospel of Thomas is the main one out of that. And others that are maybe around 200. But by this time, the Bible's already gotten its formation, and most of those are not books that, even though they call themselves Gospels, that we would call Gospels. Because they either don't talk about Jesus or they talk about weird stuff. So
The Gnostics.
yeah. So anyway, here are some guys that are in the early stages worth noting in dispensationalism. They're really huge, and most of them we don't know about. Reuben Torrey is number 2 in the Moody world, in the Dwight Moody world. Joel liked this because what does he do? He comes to Los Angeles and he starts a Bible college here, which becomes eventually, da-da-da,
Biola.
yeah. And the first head, I think he's first, is William Blackstone. William Blackstone is a Zionist before Herzog starts to try and get the British to actually create the modern state of Israel. And he actually circulates petitions, and you would not believe the signatures that he got. He started out in Chicago. All these guys are Moody types to start with. You know, they're connected to Moody in one way or another. Moody's out of Chicago. So he gets guys like Cyrus McCormick. But he also gets the President of the U.S. to sign it. Gets congressmen. Everybody and their brother says, we accept the idea that Scripture says there should be a land for the Jews. And they're basing part of their thinking, if they're following the petition that he wrote, on dispensationalist thought that says the end is coming, and it starts in part with the restoration of Israel, and we've got to let that happen. So World War I kind of interrupts it, and it goes into kind of, I don't want to say it's forgotten about, but they realize that they've lost momentum, and they say, you know what? Woodrow Wilson is a Presbyterian. He was the head of Princeton University and Princeton Seminary both, I think. They said, let's get Wilson to sign it. He did. And so you've got 2 petitions saying, after the British have, remember the Ottoman Empire in World War I, which is now
Turkey.
Mostly Turkey, yeah. They basically got defeated, and the British occupied Palestine, and they took hold of Jerusalem. So now what are you going to do with it? That's how the modern Israel comes about in that process. Even though England is staying in charge of it, they're saying, we think at some point this ought to be a homeland for Jews. Interestingly, I was just reading about this last week, the politics that went into that, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And they're just absolutely fascinating. The British were behind, and they wanted to capture the high ground, and they decided it came to be known as the Balfour Declaration. It was buried in a larger foreign policy statement, but they agreed that this ought to happen. Okay, Arnold Gablein is an actual Zionist. He actually believes that this should come to pass, and he's working behind the scenes as a friend of Israel. Blackstone gets a memorial somewhere in Jerusalem. There's a statue like at the center of a park because they love him. You know, who wouldn't? I mean, he was there before the rest of them. But Gablein is as important as Blackstone is, even though he's not in charge of a university. Blackstone and Gablein are allied with James Brooks, who the 3 of them are behind the drive to push Cyrus Schofield into writing his new Bible, or writing the new commentary in his Bible. A.C. Dixon and Reuben Torrey are the two best-known editors of what we've talked about over and over again, the so-called The Fundamentals, those 12 volumes that go out to everybody under the sun. Reuben Torrey succeeds Moody when he dies. But he doesn't stay, as we started out by saying, he doesn't stay in Chicago, he branches out. And it was said of him that he always wore a top hat when he was outside, and when you were talking with him inside, you thought he still had it on, because he was so stuffy. And yet, he managed somehow to lead a really successful revival effort in Australia, of all places.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's kind of de rigueur at this point that if you want to make a name for yourself in the revivalist world, you got to do it outside of America first. Get famous there and then come back, and everybody wants to hear what you have to say. Because if you've if you've made your bones outside of America, you're cool. You know, back you come. So Brooks has been abroad. He's heard the original Darby. He's a convert, he's a believer. And he's a preacher in St. Louis. And he influences all these other guys. But the thing that Brooks does that becomes kind of a model for everybody else is he starts creating these little mini conferences. And remember, this is toward the end of the 19th century, and now all of a sudden you got railroads. You got transcontinental railroads, so someone from LA can go to New York for a conference. It's not going to take you a month to get there. It may not take you one day, but you know, you can do this and you could have a vacation at the same time. And they're plotting, how can we get this across? How can we get dispensationalism bought into by the rest of the world? And it's these conferences that they have from city to city to city that are fabulously successful. And what William Bell Riley, that I told you about, the Minnesotan, does is he has a pre-conference. And he gooses them up before they start the conference. So they've got a massive effort starting to go city by city that's hugely successful in planting the seeds for what will develop. Here's what rightly dividing the word looks like. That's pretty clear, right? If you want to follow all the pieces, don't try and finagle it. I'll give you an easier one in a minute. So here's a non-academic definition of what we're talking about. It's a theological system by evangelicals, and what it's primarily interested in are these things. Covenants, Israel is a separate land, Israel is a separate land of promise, Israel is the homeland for the Jews, but separate from the church. Now remember, in biblical theology that we take out of, we say that Christians are the new Israel. That's what Paul uses as his expression of what's happened. What does that mean? Well, as far as the dispensationalists are concerned, it means something way different from what you've probably heard in any background in any Lutheran church you've been into. Because what Cyrus Ingerson Schofield says is, you got to draw a line. Israel is Israel. Christianity and the church are something different. And I don't know how they get there. You know, there's this wonderful phrase from West Wing. Y'all familiar with that show? Remember that? Well, there's this scene behind the scenes where they're getting ready to debate, where The president is gonna debate his Republican opponent, and the president's daughter has been captured, and they're talking about crime. And the Republican candidate says, crime, oh no. And president says, at that point, I decided to kick his you-know-what. You know, because he was not interested in, oh no, as a public stance, you know, from a national candidate. You asked me some of the things about, you know, where do they get that? I got to give that Republican candidate's answer, oh no. Why do they have to be separate? As far as they're concerned, God chose not to deal with both of them at once. So how do you get the church out of the way, since what's in play is the Old Testament and all these promises to Israel and all these covenants for Israel? How do you get the church not involved? They're both inhabiting earth. Simple. You take them off. Take the church off the earth. What's that called?
Rapture?
Yeah. Yeah. You've seen those signs, those bumper stickers? In the event of rapture, this car will be driverless?
I have seen those.
And then it turns out it's just a Tesla.
That's what they're talking about. So the idea is, if you're a true Christian, it's not that you're Israel, it's just that God has a separate plan for you. Let that sink in for a little bit. So the idea is, the Old Testament is for the Jews, the New Testament is for the Christians. And for those that aren't in either category, it's called God's wrath.
That just seems strange to me.
Well,
Because Israel, as I see it, is the Jews.
yeah,
And the church is the new covenant. That is the Christian aspect, right?
Okay.
So it's the Gentiles. All of us who were not
right,
Jewish were grafted,
right.
as it says in, right?
Now the language that you're using is the right language, and it
Mhm.
comes out of Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul's idea is Israel got off track. They messed up.
Yes.
You know, they were supposed to be a great big tree flowering for everybody, but they messed up.
Mm-hmm.
So, where they're really bad, God is going to come in and hack off those branches. And he's going to graft in,
Mm-hmm. The doors were open to others
right.
because the Jews rejected him.
But the key that you got to remember is they're not a separate tree.
No, they're not. No.
They're grafted in. Now, that's not what Schofield's saying. Schofield's saying different tree, different garden. You know, different point.
But that's not the way I read. I mean, unless the translation is wrong, that's not what it says in the Bible. It doesn't say different tree.
I'm not going to bear a brief for them, but I'm going to try and do a level best to represent where they come from. All
Sure.
right, let's look at this. This shouldn't be quite so bad because church fathers have been talking about different ages or different epochs all along. But what Darby said that Schofield is going to write up is 7 different chopping sections, segmentable, understandably different periods in history is biblical. Well, maybe you can work with that, but this is law as far as Schofield is concerned. And I'll show you some of the versions that they have. They almost all say 7. There's been a couple that have talked about maybe more or maybe less, and they define them differently from time to time. But there's no such thing outright, like you say, Tony. You know, you can't go to a chapter and verse and say, aha, here it is. But they talk about dispensation. All right, what's a dispensation? Basically, it's a segment of history, biblical history, and in that period, God tried to get through to basically the Jews. And they didn't get it. They
So,
failed the test.
An opportunity
Yeah.
to accept.
But it's a, when they didn't get it that way, he said, all right, I'm gonna roll the dice again, and I'll try again a different way. So he's gonna do that 7 times, but when we get to the 7th, everything changes. It's no longer linear if it was linear before. You can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, stop, wait, then there has to be something new. So in traditional language, we have covenants, and I think it's terribly important, and I think they got that right. This is where I will editorialize that they had the basic idea right. I think the Reform people have gone way overboard because they find a covenant everywhere. They find a covenant between Adam and Eve and God,